How are you doing, math learners? This is your free access math teacher Ash, and welcome to ML with Sir Ash. Today, we're going to discuss the introduction about quadratic equations. So, hit that subscribe button and notification bell for you to be updated of these cool math videos just like this. Hello math learners, welcome to our discussion. This is for quarter 1, week 1 of Mathematics 9. The objectives for today's lesson are as follows. Number 1, illustrate what is a quadratic equation. And number 2, what are the things that we should be learning about quadratic equations. Now, let's start. What is a quadratic equation? If we tend to consider the two words, equation is the process of using the equal sign. So everything that is using equal sign is considered to be an equation. Okay, now, what do you mean by quadratic? Quadratic means it is in the second degree. So therefore, quadratic equation is all about equations in the second degree. Question, what is in the second degree? We are talking about a variable with an exponent of 2. It is read as x squared. So a variable with an exponent of 2 is considered to be an expression in the second degree. Putting with an equal sign, it will consider to be a quadratic equation. Now, what is the standard for a quadratic equation? The standard for quadratic equation are as follows. Ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. Where this represents three terms, meaning it is a trinomial, and the a, the b, and the c are what we call real numbers. When we are talking about real numbers, this could be rational numbers and irrational numbers. Now this term with an x squared represents our equation to be in the second degree. The parts of our equation are as follows. This term is known as the quadratic term. The middle term is known as the linear term. And C here as our third term is considered to be the constant term. So, how do we know if the given equation is a quadratic equation? Let's consider some examples. Okay, math learners, I have here some exercises for us to consider which among the 5 given equation is considered to be a quadratic equation. Now, so remember, the quadratic equation is an equation in the second degree. Therefore, for us to consider that a given example is a quadratic equation, we should consider that the highest exponent is in the power of 2. Okay, now let's consider number 1. 5m minus 3 is equal to 7. Do you see this in the second degree? Okay, no. So therefore, this is not a quadratic equation. Alright, very good. Let's go to number 2. 2t squared plus 7t is equal to 12. Now, as we can see here, our variable is with a second degree power. So therefore, this is considered to be a quadratic equation. Okay, next, we go here. 5 minus 6m plus 2m squared is equal to 0. Now, as we can see in this given example, our m here has an exponent of 2 and it is the highest degree. So therefore, this is still considered as a quadratic equation. Now, let's go to number 4. 3x cubed plus 5x squared minus x plus 5 is equal to 0. As we see here, we can see that we have an x squared. However, the highest exponent here is x cubed. Therefore, this equation is not in the second power. So therefore, this is not a quadratic equation. Alright, now let's go to this given example. The quantity of w plus 3 times the quantity of w minus 2 is equal to 5. Now, do you see any power of 2 here? Okay, now, there are times that when we simplify a given equation, we will end up to its quadratic form. So, in this given example, this could be simplified. So, since in this example, we can still apply simplifications. So, if we try to simplify this one, this will become w squared. When we apply the FOIL method here for outer, we have negative 2w. Then we have the inner, we have positive 3w. And for the last term, we have negative 6 is equal to 5. So here, we can still simplify this one, so it will become w squared minus w, and we can still transpose our 5 here, so we have negative 6 or minus 6 minus 5. And if we try to simplify more, we have w squared minus w minus 11 is equal to 0. Now, as we can see, now this is already in the simplified form, and it is very clear that the highest exponent is in the second degree. Therefore, this example is considered to be a quadratic equation. Now, that is very easy, right? Now, let's consider how to arrange quadratic equations into its standard form. Now, how do we arrange our quadratic equations into standard form? Remember that the standard form is given as ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. Always write first the quadratic term, and then followed by the linear term, and then followed by the constant term. The quadratic term is the term in which the x squared or the variable with the power of 2 is located. Okay. The middle term or the linear term is the term in which we can see that our variable has no exponent. But as we all know, it is considered to have an exponent of 1. And finally, our third term or last term, it is the term in which we don't see any variables. Okay, now let us check our first example. We have here 2t squared plus 7t is equal to 12. Our quadratic term is already in its place, the first term. Our 7t, which is the linear term, is already in the middle term. Check. Now let's check here, is equal to 12. Our standard form is always equal to 0. Therefore, if that's the case, if you can see any terms that is in this side of the equation, what you will do is you just transpose them to the other side of the equation. And that is what we will do in our 12 here. We will transpose it to our left side of the equation. So giving us 2t squared plus 7t minus 12 is equal to 0. Okay, so now we have arranged our given equation to the standard form of the quadratic equation. Okay, now if you are asked to name A, B, and C, then you can simply name the A, B, and C here. A is the numerical coefficient of the quadratic term, so that's 2. B is the numerical coefficient of the linear term, and that is 7. And C is the constant term, the number without any variables. So we have negative 12. Now, let me give you this piece of advice. Do not ever name the A, B, and C if your quadratic equation is not yet in its standard form. Okay, now let's continue. We have here 5 minus 6m plus 2m squared is equal to 0. Now, as you can see, is equal to 0 is the same as our standard form. So therefore, we will not apply any transposition. But we will have to arrange our term in the left side of the equation. So let's write first our quadratic term. So it is positive 2m squared. So we write that 2m squared. Then we follow our linear term, negative 6m. So that is minus 6m. And finally, our constant term, which is positive 5. So we just put positive 5, then we put equal to 0. And this is our standard form for this equation. Okay? It's very easy. Now, given here in our example earlier, this is already in the simplest form and is arranged in our standard form. So that is how you arrange quadratic equations into standard form. Easy, right? Okay. Now, what are the other things that you must know about solving quadratic equations? Okay, next part of our discussion is solving quadratic equations. Now, when we are trying to solve the quadratic equations, we are actually solving the value of x or the value of the variable. Now, in solving the value of x, this will satisfy our given equation. For example, if we have x squared minus 5x plus 6 is equal to 0, what are the values of x? Now, in solving quadratic equation, there are at least 4 known solutions. Number 1 is what we call extracting square root. Okay. Number 2 is all about factoring. Number 3 is by completing the square. And finally, by the use of quadratic formula. So don't you worry because I will be making videos for each method. So be updated and click that subscribe button for you to stick on this discussion. Now, these four methods has its own pros and cons, meaning it has its own advantages and disadvantages. Okay, the first one is extracting square root. Normally, extracting square root can be applied if and only if you have no linear term, no bx. Okay, you don't have any linear term. Now, in our given, we have a linear term, the negative 5x. So therefore, we cannot apply extracting square root here. Okay, next, factoring. Factoring is one of the fastest way to solve quadratic equation. But the disadvantage of this method is that this can only be applied if and only if your given quadratic equation can be factored. Therefore, if you cannot factor that quadratic equation given, you cannot apply it. Okay, next, completing the square. Completing the square is technically the derivation of the quadratic formula. Though this kind of method is quite tedious, however, whatever the given, you can still apply completing the square. But then again, it is very tedious. And finally, the safest method, quadratic formula. You just need to memorize the quadratic formula and then you just input your A, B, and C and then simplify your solution. And that's it. You will have the value of your x. So these are the four methods, at least four methods that you will encounter in solving quadratic equation. Now let's go to our example. X squared minus 5x plus 6. Technically speaking, we have already discussed grade 8 lesson about factoring polynomials. Okay? Now, this kind of example is an example good for factoring. Okay, so if we factor x squared minus 5x plus 6, we're just gonna make two quantities and then we factor the first term and that is x and x. Okay, and then we factor 6 such that the factor of 6 when added together, it should result on negative 5. Now, question, what are the factors of 6? We have 1 and 6, right? However, we are dealing with negative numbers. Remember, if the product is positive, the two factors can only be both positive and both negative. Since we are dealing with a sum of negative 5, therefore, we will consider only negative pairs factors. Okay? So, negative 1 times negative 6, that is positive 6. But if we add them, it would result to negative value. Okay, later. Next, we have negative 2 and negative 3. Is there any more factors? I guess none. Okay, so if we try to add them, this will become negative 7 and this will become negative 5. Now, negative 5 here is the same as our middle term, which is negative 5x. So therefore, we will use this pair as our factors. So negative 2 and negative 3. So negative 2 and negative 3. Then that is equal to 0. So if you have already finished factoring the given quadratic equation, then you are good to go in solving the value of x. Question, how? Now this is how you solve for the value of x. Very simple. You make a separation clause and then you equate both factors into 0. So x minus 2 equals 0 and in this part, x minus 3 is equal to 0. Then you just transpose the value of x in order for you to isolate the value of x. Okay? So you transfer this one by using transposition method. So negative 2, when transposed, it will become positive 2. So that is 0 plus 2 and that is 2. Same goes here. We transpose negative 3. This will become positive 3. So that is x is equal to 0 plus 3, which will give us values of x is equal to 3 and x is equal to 2. Now, how do we know that these two values are applicable to our given equation? If we try to substitute 2 in our values of x, it will result to 0. If we try to substitute 3 in our values of x, it will still equal to 0. Therefore, these values are correct. Okay? So that is very easy, my dear learners. Don't you worry because more of these examples will be discussed in our video for factoring. Okay, now, what else do you need to know about quadratic equations? Now, after you learn about how to solve values of x or the value of the variables that will satisfy your quadratic equation, the next thing you should learn is how to know the characteristics of your roots. Okay, as we all know, x value is known as the roots of the equation, or sometimes it is known as the zeros of the equation. Now, some problems do not need for you to solve the value of x. They just want you to know the characteristics or the nature of your x. When we say nature, what kind of value or what kind of root do you have? So is it irrational numbers or rational numbers or equal numbers or unequal numbers? So more about this example or more about this discussion when we talk about discriminant. Okay, because the discriminant will tell you the nature of the roots. That is the next lesson after solving the values of x or solving quadratic equation. Next, what will follow after the lesson about discriminant? When you know about the discriminant, you will also encounter the relationship of the coefficients to its roots. Okay, so in this part of the discussion, you will be given values of the roots. And then those values will be used in a certain process in order for you to obtain the quadratic equation. And then, after the discussion about discriminant and the relationship of coefficients and its roots, you will be encountering problems involving quadratic equations. So I hope you have now seen the whole perspective about quadratic equations and what are the things you need to learn about this lesson. Now, I will be giving you some deeper lessons on the next videos. And I hope you will still be following our next sessions. So make sure to tune in on those videos. This is still your mathematics teacher, Ash. And please be reminded that it is fun to learn mathematics if we are together learning. Don't forget to click that subscribe button for you to be updated. Thank you and God bless.